Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The topic of this discussion, if we ever get to have it, is to think about what's called the elasticity of demand, and what we're interested in is looking at how responsive buyers are to a change in price, or how responsive sellers are to a change in price. We know that markets are the interaction of these two groups, buyers and sellers. And we build these two models separately, demand and supply, and we employ this assumption of one thing at a time called ceteris paribus. We know demand is downward sloping, it's an inverse relationship, it shows all the different quantities. Buyers are willing and able to buy at different per unit prices. Supply, in a similar way, is a schedule of data. It's not an amount, it's a whole series of different amounts at different possible prices. And we overlaid the two functions to represent the two sides of the market interacting, and we noted that if the price starts out at a price above X marks the spot, then you have a surplus, and it means sellers are unsatisfied. They've got stuff left over, they were willing to sell, you cheapo buyers were not willing to buy. And so that competitive pressure between the sellers will cause the price to come down. As the price comes down, you'll notice that they're not willing to produce as many units, and buyers are willing to buy additional units until you reach that one point where the plans coalesce or are identical. If instead the current price is below the equilibrium level, then we have what's called a shortage. That's unsatisfied buyers. People willing to pay the price can't get the good that they want to buy. And there, competition between the buyers will cause price to go up. Sellers seeing a shortage know there's some people willing to pay more, right? They know demand's downward sloping, right? So if at the current quantity that I'm producing, there are more people who want to buy it, some of those people will be willing to pay more for it. As I am able to raise price, which I always wanted to do, I'm willing to produce larger quantities. As the price goes up, buyers are not willing to buy as much, and so competition between the buyers is what drives the price up. And we noted that one price that coordinates these two different groups of people is called the equilibrium price, and it's the only price that coordinates their plans. It's the only price at which the rate of production, quantity supplied, matches the rate of consumption, quantity demanded. And remember, this is an amount per time period. Y'all with me? So it means they're producing 600 and putting them into the bins, and then buyers are taking 600 out of the bins in that market period. Total revenue is price times quantity, so we assume that markets have reached equilibrium or are on their way toward reaching it if something's changed. And total revenue would be price times quantity, or this area on the diagram. And then we looked at what happens when these functions change. What happens to the market price and the amount of exchange taking place when there are changes or shifts in these functions. We noted an increased demand would pull forth a higher price and a larger quantity. We noted that increase in supply, increase is always a rightward shift, would cause, the market price to come down, and again, the amount being purchased would increase. We looked at what causes then an increase in price, and there's two possible things that are going on. Either demand's increased or supply is decreased. If price is higher, one or both of those things has in fact happened. And if the price is lower, then it's either a decrease in demand or an increase in supply. So you know if price is lower, one of those two things has in fact happened. And then I summarized to you at the end that in thinking about the dynamics of markets, demand is what determines price. Demand is what determines what you have to pay in the marketplace. Cost determines the rate of production. Cost determines, if this is the price, what amount are sellers willing to produce. But it is demand that drives the marketplace. And demand, as I said, pulls forth the rate of production. Supply is really a response curve. It's actually the marginal cost curve of the firm. So that's that, and it's true. If there's a change in the price of inputs, supply would shift. But dynamically, the way to think about it is demand is what drives markets. Demand determines production and price. So we said we're interested in when demand increases. Does price go up by a lot or just by a little bit? When demand increases, does quantity go up by a lot or a little bit? And the first measure of responsiveness would be the slope of the line, Which of these two supply curves shows a greater response to a change in price, A or B? Good, B, and the reason is quantity is measured horizontally, y'all with me? And B is flatter than A, and so consequently, an increase in price would lead to a small increase in quantity for A and a much larger increase in quantity for B. So we could use slope as a representation of responsiveness. You do the same thing on the demand side. B is a more responsive depiction than A, and the same thing. If you lower price, there's a small increase in quantity, but if you lower it, there's a large increase. So a flatter curve shows a bigger quantity response, and that makes sense because quantity is measured horizontally on the problem with using slope as a measure is that you can change the slope of the line by simply changing the unit of measure on the vertical and horizontal axis. You go to work for a securities investment firm. Your boss says that she's going to make a presentation to the investors of each stock and what has happened to price over this last 5-year period. And so she gives you the data and you plug it into Excel and you say draw a line graph and you get A is the line graph. And again, you're plotting price changes over time, So you show that to her and she says, well, that's not very impressive. Looks like, yeah, price has gone up, but it doesn't look very impressive. She takes exactly the same data set, but she changes the unit of measure. So a change in price, instead of being this amount, is that amount. A bigger unit of measure on the vertical, and then the same thing on the horizontal. She changes the amount of distance for each year to be a smaller distance rather than being a larger distance. And so consequently, B looks a lot better than A does, even though it's the same data set. Y'all with me? It's the same data set. You just change the unit of measure on the two axes. And she says it's only going to be up for 10 seconds. So, you say this is, and you can see company A has done relatively well over this period. Next slide, right? Good. So economists, recognize, and by the way, the other problem is if I'm comparing responsiveness across different products, then the unit of measure that I use has to be consistent, right? And one could be measured in gallons and one could be measured in pounds or something else. So what economists said is instead of taking the actual change in quantity in response to price, which is in fact the slope of the line, let's calculate the percentage change in quantity and the percentage change in price. Because think about it, if I calculate a percentage change, the unit of measure disappears, right? If I take the percentage change in quantity is the actual change in quantity divided by where I started from, that's called the point elasticity of demand. And if I divide a change in quantity, and it's measured in pounds, and divide it by the initial quantity, which was measured in pounds, the pounds cancel out, and I just get a ratio. Good. So that avoids this unit of measure problem in calculating the responsiveness. The dependent variable is the numerator. That's the change in quantity in response to a change in price. And so the independent variables, the dependent variable is the numerator, independent variable is the denominator. And we know for demand it will always be negative. It'll always be negative because demand's downward sloping, right? An increase in price leads to a smaller quantity. A decrease in price, which is a negative change, leads to an increase in quantity. The problem with point elasticity, however, is that depending on which direction you move between 2 points on the demand curve, you end up with different numbers for elasticity. If the 2 points on your demand curve are at a price of $4, you sell 120. At a price of $6, you sell 80. If you calculate it from A to B, then the reference point is for quantity is 120, and the amount of change is 40, right? So you'd get 40 over 120 or 33%. And then the same thing for price. And then if you go the opposite direction, start at B and go to A, then the reference quantity would be 80 and the change in quantity would be 40, which would give you 50% in that way. So measuring from either endpoint biases the number. And so the way economists solve for that is to calculate what is called the arc elasticity or midpoint elasticity of demand. And what I've done is, you can see, instead of dividing by the beginning quantity, I've divided the change in quantity by the midpoint between the two quantities. Q1 plus Q2 divided by 2 would be halfway. And the same thing for the price ratio. The actual change in price divided by P1 plus P2 over 2, the midpoint between the two prices. If you do that, you get -1 in either direction, because the reference point's the same. You all with me? The reference point's always the midpoint, right? And so if you calculate it from A to B or B to A, both of them use the same reference point, and so you're going to get the same number. You're going to get an unbiased estimate of responsiveness. So if you're asked to calculate elasticity, always use the arc elasticity method. Always use this unbiased estimate. If I'm asking you to do it, I'll probably say calculate arc elasticity, but that's what you want to do in any case to avoid the biases. So we know what it is. It's a ratio of the responsive quantity to a change in price. So it's a ratio of the percentage change in quantity and the percentage change in price. If it's the case that the quantity adjustment, and remember this is moving between 2 points on a demand curve, if it's true that the amount of change in quantity, the percentage change, is bigger than the percentage change in price, then the number you're going to get is bigger than 1. It's always negative, but the absolute value will be larger than 1 because quantity is in the numerator. So a bigger numerator would mean the ratio is going to be bigger than 1. That is called elastic. Demand is then called elastic. And what that means is that the quantity is bigger than the percentage change in price. If demand is elastic, then lowering price increases total revenue. Just visualize it. I lower my price by 5%. So I get 5% less for every unit that I sell. But I sell 20% more units. Everybody see it? Good. So you can just see I lose some here, but I gain more by this movement. And so when demand is responsive, highly responsive, lowering price increases total revenue. I don't know if it increases profit because I'm selling more units, which means total cost has gone up. But I do know it's increased total revenue, right? That part of it. Good. If it's a wash, if it's unitary elastic, meaning the percentage change in quantity matches the percentage change in price. I raise price by 10%, so I'm getting 10% more on what I sell, but I sell 10% less. Total revenue is the same. Y'all with me? I get more, on the ones I sell, but I've lost 10% of my sales. So 10% divided by 10% is 1, and demand is unitary elastic. If that's the case, then there's no change in total revenue. As I said, I lower price by 50%. Wow, so I'm really cut my price. And I sell 50% more units. So I've lost on the ones I was selling, but I gain 50% more units. That revenue balances the amount of loss that I had when I lowered the price. Same's true for a price increase. I raise price by 5%, so I get 5% more money, but I lose 5% of my sales. So unitary elastic is like the midpoint. It is the midpoint, actually. If the quantity response is less than the denominator, if the quantity response to a change in price is smaller than the percentage change in price, then we define demand as being inelastic. Inelastic. And what that means is it doesn't stretch very much. Buyers are not very responsive to the price change. If that's the case, the ratio will be smaller than 1 because the quantities in the numerator is smaller than the quantity in the denominator, so you get a fraction in that case. But if demand is inelastic, raising price will actually increase total revenue because the increase in price is greater than the percentage of lost sales. I raise price by 10% and I only lose 2% of my sales. So I'm going to get in more revenue, right? Total revenue goes up when demand's inelastic. And then when you turn to profit, if demand is inelastic and you raise price, profit will go up. Because think about it, revenue goes up and total cost goes down because I'm producing and selling fewer units. Everybody with me? Right? So if demand's inelastic, raising price will increase total revenue and will increase profitability. The implication of that is a firm would never knowingly price in the inelastic range of demand. A firm would never knowingly set their price if demand is inelastic. They would raise the price because they know, profit's going to go up if I do that. Everybody with me? Good. Yeah.
So like gasoline, would that be an inelastic?
Yeah.
Right.
No, it's great. I'm glad you brought it up because that's the exact example. The demand for gasoline as a product is very inelastic, right? People, you guys don't adjust much when you go in the gas station and the price has gone up, even by 50 cents or something like that. So the demand for gasoline is inelastic. But the demand for gasoline at a particular station is very elastic, right? At a particular station. Because if he raises his price and all the other stations don't raise price, he's going to lose a lot of sales, right? So that's the answer to it. For the product category, it's inelastic, but for the individual seller, it's elastic. Good example. On a straight line demand curve, it turns out just the geometry of the curve is that the upper half is the elastic region of the curve. The midpoint is unitary elastic. This is axis to axis. And the lower half is the inelastic portion. If you think back to my 10-9-8 standard demand curve, $10 I sold one shirt, total revenue is 10. I lower my price to 9, I sell 2 shirts, 18. Total revenue is going up, right? Lower my price to 8, 3/8 are 24. 4 7s are 28 or something. 5 6s are 30. But in the lower range, where demand's inelastic, if I charge $1, I sell 10, so total revenue is 10. If I charge $2, I sell 9, and I'm selling 2 units, so I'm getting 18. Everybody see it? So inelastic, you want to raise price. Elastic, you want to lower price to maximize total revenue sales. Understanding that, you can then draw accurate curves geometrically by simply drawing the curve so that you're on the upper half or the lower half. So in A, if you look at this demand curve, extend it all the way out to where it would meet the axis. You're clearly on the upper half of the curve. That is an elastic demand curve. So geometrically, when you lower price, it will show that total revenue goes up. If you look at B, or the one on the right, and extend that curve to where it meets the axes, where's my gun? All the way up here, then you're clearly on the lower half of the curve. And so that's the inelastic range. So in solving problems graphically, if you draw a curve that's flatter than 45, it's elastic. If you draw a curve that's steeper than 45, it's inelastic. And you'll get the right result when you look at the price change. Lowering the price, don't do this to me. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, good. Okay, good. So we understand the idea of highly responsive and not very responsive. So now when you look at the marketplace and compare the elasticity of demand or supply, it's going to affect how much price changes when something shifts in the marketplace. Here I've drawn a relatively elastic supply, flat curve. Notice demand increases and price goes up, but not very much. And quantity goes up by a much larger amount. So if supply is more elastic than demand, the quantity response is bigger than the price change in that particular way. If instead, for the same change in demand, I have an inelastic supply, then there's a bigger price effect, right? Price goes up by a larger amount because it takes more of a price increase to pull forth more production because supply is very inelastic. Do the same thing with changing supply and change the elasticity of demand. If demand's very elastic, when supply decreases, it doesn't take much of a change in price to bring about the adjustment. And there's a large change in quantity because demand's flatter, it's more responsive. And then if it's inelastic, if demand's inelastic, then there's a much bigger price response to a change in the amount supplied. These curves are both relatively inelastic. And the example did I start the recording again?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I did. The example of this is actually the demand and supply currently of oil on the world market. It used to be the case that we discovered major holdings of oil after World War II in the Middle East. And they sent geologists over, and they figured out there was all this oil in these different countries. And so the Seven Sisters, which are the 7 major oil companies in the United States, decided that they wanted to import oil from over there. And these countries were run by these guys named sheikhs, right? And they had these robes on and, you know, hats and stuff. And so, number one, they divided the market up by countries. And they did a lottery. And Texaco got Algeria, and I think Exxon got Saudi Arabia. And so they didn't have to compete with each other, right? They divided the market up so they wouldn't have to compete. So these guys from Texas, big oil guys, right, with the Texas hat and everything, go over and meet the sheikh and in Saudi Arabia. And he said, we'd like to buy oil from you. And the sheikh said, oh well, let's see. Where it's located, there are no roads. And Exxon said, well, we'll build the roads, right? And he said, well, but at that location, there's no electricity to run the pumps. We'll put electricity in, right? Well, okay, but there's no way to get the oil from that location to the coast. Oh, we'll put in the pipeline. Okay, but our port can't handle the giant ships that you want to use. Oh, we'll rebuild the port, right? And the sheikh said, well, okay, let's talk. And they entered into an agreement in each country, and Texaco and Algeria built out all the facilities and so forth. And then after about 2 years, Algeria came to Texaco and said, we've just nationalized all of the production facilities. So they all now belong to the people of Algeria, which means they belong to the sheikh, right? And the Texaco guy said, well, no. See, we had a contract and with the sheikh, and the guy said, but he's not the sheikh anymore. I'm the sheikh. And so now we have to talk to me about doing it. So I love the story because it just shows the hubris of these guys with their giant companies spending tens of millions of dollars to build out the infrastructure, and it ended up that they were not that successful. Saudi Arabia insisted that Exxon put in twice the volume of what they wanted to, twice the volume of the rate that Exxon had announced they wanted to extract the oil. So the pipes were bigger, and there was more drilling facilities and so forth. And the reason for that is they wanted flexibility in the amount of oil that they could pump, because they knew they wouldn't be locked into Exxon forever, and they wanted to be able to change the volume. So if you looked at the supply curve over time, it was relatively flat. In other words, demand increased, and all these countries had excess capacity. So the price didn't go up by very much. But as we got into the 70s, now the supply curve is much steeper because they're operating close to capacity. And so now to get more out, you have to like delay maintenance, or you have to do something that's expensive to do to get any faster rate of production. So supply is very inelastic, and then we've already said the demand for oil is very inelastic because the substitutes they're not close substitutes for it. Consequently, small changes in supply lead to big price adjustments. When what was the one that hit Texas, the hurricane? Harvey. When Harvey hit Texas, they shut down all the refineries, and particularly on Galveston Island, which is a major producer, all that production got shut down, and the refining in Houston got shut down. So there was a big decrease. There was like a 10% decrease in the amount of supply in the United States, and they can estimate when these things happen what is the percentage change in the marketplace. And so prices went up all over. Right? Gas prices went up all over. And some people saw that and they said, well, listen, these prices always move together, like Texaco and Exxon. They all raise prices and they all lower prices together. The price differentials tend to stay, but they all move together. So that's clearly a sign of collusion, right? They must all be getting together and agreeing on what they're doing. Well, it turns out that that's not the case. It's an extremely competitive market. But all of them know the measurements of elasticity, and they know it at each station in addition to the general ones in the market. So if you tell them that this plant's going to shut down for this period of time, they know the percentage change in quantity. If they know the elasticity, they know how much of a price change would be necessary for people to adjust to that smaller amount. Everybody with me? If you know two, you can solve for the other one in that way. So it actually is, it's evidence of the fact that they do know these things, and they actually compete in how accurate they are. So the question is, well, why are some demands highly responsive and some are not very responsive? What causes the elasticity of demand to be greater or less? And the major factor is the closeness and number of substitutes, the number and closeness of substitute products. The more close substitutes there are, the easier it is for people to switch to some other product. Take pizzas. Domino's is competing with all these other ones, Papa John's, Little Caesars, just a whole bunch of them, right? And so if Domino's raises their price, they're going to lose a lot of sales. Demand's going to be very elastic, lots of very similar close substitutes. Yeah. The second factor is your knowledge about the price change and your knowledge of the availability of substitutes. If you don't know the substitutes are there, then you can't switch to them. And if you don't even know the price has changed, then you don't have any tendency to switch what you're doing. So the more you know about the price change and the more you know about the available substitute, the more demand tends to be elastic. If you go into Sears paint store, there's a pyramid of paint cans in the center, and the banner above it says Sears highest supreme valued exterior latex house paint, wonderful, and it sells for like $42 a gallon, and it's Sears Best, and it has a picture of a nice pretty house, and there's a couple standing by the ladder with a coffee cup, and there are instructions on the can, and the instructions on the can say this paint is so good that it's like a fine wine. You need to open it for 1 hour before applying it. And the reason is because the pigment needs to oxidate with the oxygen in the air so that you'll get complete coverage. So you stir it up and then keep it open for an hour, and then it paints solid right over there. In the same store, if you go to the cash register to check out, and you look down behind the register at the shelf, there's some cans of paint down there, and the label is like it's like an off-white label, like it's an old label, right? And it says TP109 exterior latex house paint, and it sells for like $8.95 a gallon. Good. So, how often do you paint your house? I love answering this because all the guys say, every 15 years, and the women say every 7 years or something. You don't do it very often, right? So you have not invested a lot in knowledge about the substitutes for paint, right? Paint is paint, right? And you believe markets work, and so you clearly believe that this stuff I'm buying is the best, and that's what I want. I don't want to paint this house anytime soon, so I'm going to get the best paint I possibly can. You say to me, look, paint is paint, and you buy the $8.95 can of paint. Good. It has no instructions on it. It's just a can of paint, right? So we get home, and I have to wait an hour each day, and you laugh at me and say, you're stupid. What's true about the 2 cans of paint? What's true about the paint in both cans? It's the same. Good. But because you have very little information about the substitutes, you're the inelastic demander. And the professional painters who paint every day know what that paint is. You all with me? Good. So you raise the price to the inelastic demanders, and you lower the price to those who have more information, because they're the more elastic demanders in the marketplace. We get finished painting the house. We take a look back. My house is perfectly covered. Your house has this kind of patchiness to it, right? Like it, yeah, not. So you agree with me at the end. Yeah, you got better paint than I did. But the reason is that you didn't have the instructions, right? And that's the way they prevent people from cheating in the marketplace, right? Because you'll write it up, on whatever it is. You'll blog it or something on Facebook, right? Good. Yeah. Third, the percentage of your income you spend on a good, the higher the percentage, the more elastic your demand tends to be. If chewing gum goes from $1 a pack to $1.25, number one, you may not even notice it because you just go to 7-Eleven and buy a bunch of stuff, right, and write it up. And number two, it's this very small part of your expenditures. So you're unlikely to adjust the quantity you chew very much because of this. Well, that's a 25% increase. That's a 25% increase. Suppose your tuition goes up by 25%. Would there be a big change? Yeah, a lot of it just means you have bigger student loans. Good. So a higher percentage, you're going to be more elastic because you're going to look into the alternatives. If you're shopping for a car, you do a lot of investigation of information about substitutes and so forth. And by the way to buy a car is to buy a used car that's about 2 years old with low mileage, and you can get on Carfax all the facts about the car. How many owners there were, one owner, how long was it on the road, even though it's a 2-year-old car, it was only on the road for 14 months. And I saved $8,000. I bought a Nissan Maxima, my second car. And with the money, with the information you now have on the internet, you even know what the dealer paid for the car, right? You know what the dealer paid. There's a lot of cars that get turned in after 2 years because people have, or 3 years because they have these leases, right? My car, no one had ever sat in the back seat. Nobody had ever sat in the back seat of the car. You could just tell that from buying, right? My son runs a web design company up in Santa Barbara. And he does website page updates, and he designs websites, and he does pictures and logos and videos and all kinds of stuff. And so I asked him, what are you charging for posting a new page, for updating a page? And he said $50. And he has all kinds of clients. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson have a tropical fish store in downtown Santa Barbara, and they have a website. And once a month they change the fish of the month, right? The fish that's on sale. And so they change that page once a month. And then other companies, one of which is Verizon, and he updates their website. He updates their maps that are on websites. Now, if you look at those two people, the Johnsons are this little tiny fish store, right? So the percentage of their income or budget that's spent on the website is much higher than it is for Verizon. Verizon has millions of dollars, right, in their budget. When does Verizon want that map changed? Right now, because most of the changes expand the coverage maps, and so they want to get it up right away. And so what I told him is adopt the following pricing strategy. Standard page update, 5 to 7 business days, $50. If you want a 3-day express, then it's $100. If you want it overnight, it's $200. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yeah, shipping.
Amazon's shipping fees, right? It's the same thing, right? And the difference in price is not due to the difference in cost. It's due to the understanding that if you want it today, somebody is willing to pay $72 to have it delivered today, etc. So he adjusted it, and it worked really well. I'm a good friend who's in Greensboro, North Carolina, whose father is a mortician, and I don't know if you know it, but mortuaries are licensed by the state, and they license a limited number of them, and so it's kind of like a monopoly in the area. You have the only license in Greensboro, or maybe there's one other, and so he's very wealthy. And then he opened little ones in the surrounding towns, the little towns and stuff. So he's very wealthy, and she decided she wanted to open a boutique store for kitchen cooking and stuff. And so they were building out the shopping center, so he bought the space and they built it out. And I went back at Christmas about 5 or 6 years ago and visited the store, and it's just beautiful, just beautiful. And all the women working there are very attractive and very smart. They all know the products, right? They have demonstrations, where they cook things and show you how to do things, and make recommendations on what combination of napkins and all that kind of stuff. So it really high-end stuff, and then some standard stuff too, standard flatware. So I said, "How do you price?" And she said, "I use Keystone pricing." And Keystone pricing is often used at retail, and it's 100% markup over cost. And so it's easy to do. You just see what you paid for it, and you charge double that. So it's easy to set prices. And she had this giant globe. It was about 4 feet in diameter, and it was in wood, just beautiful wood. And then when you opened it up, it was a bar inside. So it had the spots for the bottles and the glasses and all of those things, and it was really, really, really nice. And I said, "How much are you selling it for?" And she said, $300. And I said, "How did it go?" And she said, "I sold out the first week. I put it on the floor." So I said to her, "Look, nobody else in Greensboro has this product. There are no close substitutes to this product. She buys it. She bought it out of Chicago and someplace." So I said, "What you want to do on this product is sell it for like $800 or $900. And then if it gets closer to Christmas and you haven't bought it, then you put it on sale and people think they're getting a bargain, right? Good. And then on your flatware or on your placemats that are the same ones that Macy's carries across the shopping center, price them 10% above Macy's price. And the reason is that her store is much nicer than Macy's, so people would be willing to pay a little bit more, right, in competition." So she did, and I visited the next Christmas, and she was just ecstatic. She'd just done really well. She didn't pay me anything. But she did other things well. So. Final determinant is the period of time following the change in price. And that is such a strong effect that it's called the second law of demand. The second law of demand. First law of demand was lower price people buy more, right? Inverse relationship. Second law of demand, the longer the time period following a change in price, the more elastic demand is, or the bigger the quantity adjustment will tend to be over a longer period of time. The reason that is true is if you look at the other factors, you can see why it would be true. Number one, over time, you'll know more about the substitute products. Years ago, beef was the major form of meat that people cooked. Chicken was basically fried chicken, and that's about all you did with chicken. There was a drought, and so a lot of the guys sold off their herds, and so beef prices went up after the sell-off, and relative to chicken prices. And so people were looking for a cheaper alternative, but initially they didn't know how to cook chicken besides frying it. Well, over time, all these women's magazines, like Good Housekeeping, and what are the other magazines they have for households, right? I don't know. Good House, there's a whole bunch of them, right? Good Housekeeping and stuff, began to publish all these recipes for chicken. All these recipes. There's a great chicken and rice with mushroom soup, and all these alternative recipes. And so consequently, the quantity of chicken sold increased because there's more information about how to use that substitute. Secondly, over time, there tend to be more substitutes. 1979, Saudi Arabia, or OPEC, greatly restricted the sale of oil, and gasoline prices went up a lot. And we actually ended up rationing gasoline in the United States because they wanted to prevent the price from going even higher. And one of the schemes that was adopted was odd, even license plate numbers. So if the last number on your license plate was even, you got to shop on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And if it was odd, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And then Sunday was reserved for commercial vehicles. And that was the way they restricted the number of people in the lines, etc. So over time, the desire for alternative kinds of cars grew substantially, and more recently, as you know, the desire for non-polluting vehicles has increased dramatically, and so there are a lot more hybrids available today than before. And you have Tesla with the electric car, and you have hydrogen cars that only emit water as the byproduct of the thing. So demand's more elastic because over time there are more things you can switch to, right, in result. And finally, over time, you can increase, it gives you an increased opportunity to change the complementary package of goods that determine how much you buy of something. In this case, the automobile is a complementary good to the purchase of gasoline. And so over a longer period of time, you're going to adjust more. Like you're in the second year of a third year lease of an SUV where you get 12 miles per gallon, and the price of gas goes up to $5. Well, you'll probably drive somewhat less, right, as a result. But when that lease expires, then the next car you're going to look at miles per gallon, right, and you're going to get something that's much more efficient. So over time, the amount of gasoline you'd purchase would decline by a lot more than in the initial case. And then finally, you know, when you graduate and looking for a new job, if gas prices are high, then you'd look to locate closer to where you're going to work, right? And what's happened in downtown LA is that they've converted a whole bunch of buildings now to condominiums, upper floors, apartments, and then you don't have to go anywhere, right? So. Now, this idea, yes, ma'am. Oh, good, thank you. Very good. This is what it looks like. So this is the wall over there, and this is the walkway over here. And you want to write your name first and last upside down from the way you would look at it, so that I can read it, right? Right? Now, take your time when it gets to you and be sure that you know where you are. I had one class, the third row just could never get it right. They kept putting themselves backwards, like that guy would put himself over there. So that's that.
Does that mean we're here? I'm gonna mess this up.
No, you're not, because I'm going to instruct you. This is
Okay.
and you're number one, so put your first name and your second name, just like that, first and second.
Okay.
Print clearly. Print clearly.
so much pressure.
Who reminded me? Good. Send me an email. It's 2 points. Yeah. No, I give extra credit for people who do things for me. Right? Good. So this notion of elasticity can be applied to measuring, folks, this notion of elasticity can be applied to measuring how responsive the quantity is to a change in anything else. It doesn't have to be just price. An example is you can calculate what's called the income elasticity of demand. When income goes up, how much does the quantity sold increase, right? Normal good, right? So the change in quantity is always in the numerator, and the change in the independent variable is in the denominator. So if I'm looking at how income affects what you buy, it would be percentage change in quantity sold in response to percentage change in income or wealth. For most goods that we said are normal goods, that would be a positive relationship. Income goes up, that's the denominator. Quantity purchased goes up, the numerator. The ratio would be positive. And here are just some examples of estimates of these elasticities. Clothing looks like it's close to unitary, and that is a 10% increase in income almost generates a 10% increase in sales. Stereo equipment and TVs and computers and that kind of stuff has a much higher income elasticity. 10% increase in income leads to like a 30% increase in dollars spent. Now, it doesn't mean that you buy 3 times as many TVs, but it goes into quality adjustments. So as income goes up, you spend more on the 3D TV or whatever it is. For inferior goods, and for inferior goods, it would be negative. As income goes up, you buy less of that particular good. What would be true about, did I talk about Starbucks coffee? What would you guess about Starbucks coffee? Would that be a normal good or an inferior good? Starbucks. As income rise, would you guess people tend to buy more Starbucks?
Yes.
Good. It's actually what's called a superior good, and that is the percentage change in quantity is actually greater than, for some groups, the percentage change of income. So if I'm Starbucks, I want to find the places in the world where incomes are rising rapidly. In what country have incomes been rising rapidly? 10% growth for a number of 10, 12% growth for a number of years. China, right? Good. Starbucks now has 274 outlets in China. On the books for this year, they're going to build, they're either in construction or planned construction of 300 more stores in China. So it's a big increase in sales. When I first heard that Starbucks was going to sell coffee in China, I thought, that is so stupid. The Chinese don't drink coffee, they drink what? Tea. They drink tea. Well, anytime you think you're so smart, you're probably wrong, right? Starbucks probably knows what they're doing, right? It turns out that there's been a big increase in taste and preference in China for all things Western, like jeans. And coffee is this little nicety that only cost me $5 or something, but it's a very nice experience. The Starbucks in China are like restaurants, and that is you go in, there's a maitre d' to seat you, they bring you menus, you order the food, they bring you the food, and so forth. And so it's this really nice, pleasant experience. One of my Chinese students from USC came up to me and said, that's true in many areas, but she said in Shanghai, it's the same as the U.S. outlet, meaning you come, get your coffee, and go because you're busy and stuff. But it was interesting. Good. So it is definitely a high income elasticity of demand. They're also closing, I think, like 62 locations in the United States in areas where incomes have fallen, particularly like Detroit has probably closed all of their outlets in Detroit, etc. So when people's income goes down, do they buy less coffee? Good. They buy less Starbucks and they buy more of what? Good. Folgers, Dunkin' Donuts, Arco gourmet coffee. It's a gas station, people. those are inferior goods, was my point, right? Like Ralph's Coffee and those things. When incomes go down, Starbucks is a normal good. They lose sales, but the sales get transferred to the inferior good, which increases the amount. So good. Cross price elasticity means I want to measure the effects on the quantity that I'm selling in response to the change in the price of some other good. It could be a substitute, it could be a complement. So notice the way you would calculate it. Quantity of X is always in the numerator. That's always in the numerator. And now you're saying, how does that change when the price of another good changes? Whether it's a competitor, whether it's a complement, what is the effect on my sales of a change in price of this other product? Good. For substitutes, it would be a positive relationship. Meaning, if my competitor raises his price, people will buy more from me. Everybody with me? Good. So for substitutes, it's a positive relationship. They lower price, I lose sales. Two negatives make it that. For complements, it's the inverse of that. For complementary products, if they go up in price, then I lose sales because the activities become more expensive. Strongest complements that I know of are peanut butter and jelly. Very strong complements. It turns out that 60% of jelly consumption is consumed in combination with peanut butter. So they're very, very strong complements. Smucker's makes jellies and jams. And about 20 years ago, the peanut farmers in Georgia went to Congress and they said, you know, peanuts grow in the ground. And Congress said, okay. And they said, well, some people are importing them now from foreign countries. And we don't know what's in the ground in those countries. There's no safety going on. They could be next to gas stations that leak. They could be radioactive. They could be what are those places called where it's a cleanup site, right? Yeah, nuclear dump site or something like that. There ought to be a law to protect Americans from these horrible, inferior, alien peanuts. And they probably had been a couple examples of something going wrong, right, that they could point to as evidence of this. So Congress said, well, yeah, we need to protect the American public. So they put all kinds of quota restrictions on importation of peanuts. You may recall that Iranian pistachios had that red dye on them. And it made them really unpleasant. You got the dye all over your hands when you're eating them, but that was their way of, you know, putting a restriction on the importation. They were so successful that 10 years later they went back to Congress and they said, you know, peanuts grow in the ground. And Congress said, yeah, we covered that some time ago. Well, some people in the United States are now raising peanuts on land they've never raised peanuts on before. And we don't know what's in that land. It could be next to a landfill or it could be next to a gas station. And there ought to be a law limiting peanut production to those plots of land that we know are safe. And those are the plots on which we're currently growing peanuts. And Congress said, yeah, that makes sense, right? So they issued certificates to you per acre if you're currently growing peanuts. You with me? So you had 3 acres, you get 3 certificates. You had 10 acres, you get 10 certificates. But here's the beauty of the system. At the last minute, they made the certificates transferable. They made the certificates saleable, transferable, which means they negated the whole point of issuing the certificates, right? And so some really smart guys in Georgia went around and bought up all these certificates from these little farmers. Guys raised, you know, like 2 acres and, you know, 1.5 acres and stuff like that. And they, you know, I'll give you $1,000 for your certificate. Well, you just changed tobacco or something. It's $3,000, right? And then they opened up giant peanut operations, and Jimmy Carter's family made the family money by raising peanuts. They're a very, very wealthy family, and that was where the money came from, the raising peanuts. Every year, Smucker's gives donations to political candidates in Congress and senators. And if you look at their website, it says, you know, we're a family organization, and we believe that people all over the world should have the right to have family businesses and compete in international trade. Well, what they're really doing is they're trying to get enough free traders elected so they can get this ban on importation of peanuts out of the way, or raise the quotas to get more peanuts in, which would lower the price of peanut butter, which raises the demand for Smucker's jelly. It's estimated that those restrictions cost you about 40 cents per jar. Standard size jar of peanut butter would be 40 cents cheaper if you allowed importation. And then finally, cross-price elasticity is used to measure closeness of substitutes. Vaughn's and Ralph's sells your data to the manufacturers or rents it to them, and so they get what all the members are buying, and then they can look at what happens when this price changes, which other products do people buy, so they can get a much better estimate of who are the close substitutes and who are the close complements. Pepsi-Cola bought Frito-Lay, and the reason was that as complements, somehow that was a stronger relationship than just potato chips or something else. And then finally, courts use cross-price elasticity to measure market power of the firm, to see whether when somebody changes price, you lose a lot of sales, then you don't have much market power, right? Or if they leave the industry and you get a lot more sales, then you have a market power. Good.